You have been calling it ingratitude because the truth feels more dangerous. You look at the life you worked for, the responsibilities you accepted, the relationships you protected, and the identity you carefully assembled, yet something inside you no longer answers when your name is called. Nothing may be visibly wrong. That is what makes the experience so difficult to explain. The structure still stands. The promises still bind you. Other people may even admire what you have built, but you are living inside it like a guest who has overstayed in a house that once felt like home. You tell yourself that mature people should be satisfied. You remind yourself of everything you wanted and eventually received. Then you feel ashamed that achievement has not produced the loyalty you expected from your own soul. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact rupture between the life a person consciously constructs and the life the deeper psyche eventually demands. He understood that the personality capable of building your first life is not always the personality meant to inhabit your whole life. Jung called the larger movement individuation, the long, often painful process through which you become psychologically whole instead of merely socially functional. Individuation does not begin because you have failed at life. It often begins because you have succeeded at becoming someone who can no longer contain everything you are. The anxiety, numbness, irritation, grief, and private fantasies of escape are not necessarily proof that your life is worthless. They may be evidence that your old identity has completed its task and is now resisting its own transformation. The conflict becomes most painful when the old life is not obviously bad. If a relationship were openly cruel, a career completely empty, or a community unmistakably hostile, departure might feel justified. But when much of the life is decent, leaving any part of it can seem morally suspect. You wonder whether you are restless, spoiled, unstable, or incapable of commitment. You try to restore gratitude by force. You list your advantages. You compare your pain with suffering that appears more legitimate. Yet the psyche does not become honest through comparison. It simply becomes quieter, more indirect, and more determined to be heard. Jung used the word persona for the social face through which you meet the world. The persona is not false by definition. You need it to work, love, cooperate, and belong. It becomes dangerous only when you forget that it is a useful interface and begin treating it as your entire identity. Then, the role does not merely organize your life, it colonizes it. You become the reliable one, the successful one, the reasonable one, the healer, the achiever, the quiet one, or the person who never changes their mind. Eventually, every genuine impulse must request permission from the role. You may notice the conflict through symptoms that seem unrelated. Ordinary conversations leave you exhausted. Accomplishments produce relief, but no nourishment. Plans that once excited you now feel like administrative obligations. You become irritated by people who expect the version of you that you trained them to expect. At night, you imagine a different city, different work, a different rhythm, or simply a room in which nobody needs you to perform continuity. These images may not be literal instructions. They are symbolic protests against a life in which too little of you is allowed to exist. A man sits in his parked car after work, with both hands still resting on the steering wheel. His house is visible through the windshield, warm lights on, dinner waiting. He reaches for his phone, opens no application, and lets the screen go dark again. When he finally enters, he smiles before closing the door quietly behind him, as if rehearsing the face his family knows. The danger is not that you will immediately destroy your life. The greater danger is that you will remain outwardly faithful while becoming inwardly absent. An unconscious transition does not disappear. It leaks into contempt, procrastination, compulsive distraction, vague resentment, bodily tension, emotional affairs, sudden idealizations, and fantasies of total escape. What you refuse to change consciously may begin changing you through symptoms. The first truth is that your old life may have been built around a wound that no longer deserves authority. Jung observed that consciousness develops through compensation. When one part of you feels endangered, another part becomes exaggerated to restore balance. A child who feels powerless may become exceptionally competent. A person who fears abandonment may become indispensable. Someone raised amid chaos may construct a life of perfect control. These adaptations can create real success, but success does not erase the wound that selected the destination. A woman checks the locks twice before leaving for a weekend away. Her team has told her that everything is covered, yet she sends one more message from the taxi and watches the typing indicator until a reply appears. At the hotel, she opens her laptop before unpacking her clothes. When her partner asks whether she can stop working, she says, quietly and sincerely, that she does not know what stopping would expose. You may not be losing ambition. You may be losing your willingness to keep using achievement as anesthesia. What you have called discipline may have contained a bargain. If you become impressive enough, useful enough, secure enough, or admired enough, you will never again have to feel the original helplessness. When that bargain stops working, the collapse of motivation can feel terrifying, but the psyche may be withdrawing energy from a strategy that has already given you everything it knows how to give. The next truth is that belonging can become a form of self-abandonment long before anyone intends to harm you. Jung understood that the collective offers identity in exchange for conformity. Every family, profession, friendship group, and culture carries an unwritten agreement about who you are allowed to become. These agreements are rarely spoken because their power depends on appearing natural. You learn what earns warmth and what produces distance. Over time, you anticipate the reaction before it happens and censor yourself before anyone else needs to. A man listens while friends repeat an opinion he once shared. He feels a sentence forming, then lifts his glass instead. Someone turns to him and says, "You know how it is," and he nods half a second too late. On the walk home, he remembers the unsaid sentence more clearly than anything that was actually spoken. You may still love the people who know your old shape. The problem is not that they are malicious. The problem is that relationships develop around predictable patterns, and your growth introduces uncertainty into the system. When you stop laughing at what diminishes you, stop providing immediate reassurance, stop carrying every emotional burden, or begin naming desires that were previously hidden, other people may experience your honesty as withdrawal. They may call you distant when you are becoming present to yourself. This is where guilt becomes a guard at the threshold. Guilt reminds you of sacrifices made for you. It displays the faces of people who might feel confused. It tells you that changing the arrangement means denying the love within it. But love and arrangement are not identical. You can honor what a relationship has given you while admitting that the role you occupy inside it is costing you too much. Jung warned against being swallowed by collective identity because whatever is excluded from conscious life does not vanish. It becomes shadow. Your anger enters the shadow when kindness is the only permitted face. Your authority enters the shadow when compliance guarantees belonging. Your tenderness enters the shadow when strength earns respect. Eventually, You begin meeting these disowned qualities through projection. You admire strangers who live with freedom. You condemn people whose selfishness resembles your own forbidden boundaries. The outer world becomes a theater for the life you will not claim directly. What you are calling alienation may be the first honest distance between your actual nature and the belonging you purchased by remaining recognizable. That distance hurts because it exposes a possibility you have tried not to consider. Some people may prefer your role to your reality. The deeper truth is that the loss of meaning often begins as the return of the unlived life. Jung did not treat meaning as a decorative addition to comfort. He saw the need for meaning as fundamental to psychological life, especially when the goals of the first half of life have been reached or exposed as insufficient. The unlived life contains capacities, desires, griefs, and forms of attention that had no place in the personality you developed. When these neglected parts return, they do not always arrive as clear desires. They may first appear as boredom, envy, restlessness, sadness without an obvious cause, or fascination with something that seems impractical. A woman stands at the sink while a song plays from a neighbor's open window. She turns off the water and remains still, holding a plate beneath the tap. For 3 minutes, she remembers the instrument she stopped playing 20 years earlier. When the song ends, she dries the same plate twice and tells no one why her eyes have filled. Dreams and spontaneous images often carry this compensatory function. Jung treated them as communications from the unconscious, not commands and not random debris. When conscious life becomes too narrow, the unconscious produces figures and situations that restore excluded possibilities. You may dream of missed trains, hidden rooms, unfinished houses, wild animals, flooded corridors, or strangers who seem more alive than you feel. The image asks where movement, space, instinct, emotion, or unfamiliar identity has been denied. The mistake is to interpret every impulse as an instruction for dramatic action. The opposite mistake is to interpret none of them as meaningful. Mature attention holds the image without immediately obeying or dismissing it. You allow it to reveal what your conscious plan has omitted. The psyche rarely begins by giving you a complete replacement life. It begins by making the old one impossible to inhabit unconsciously. Your boredom may therefore contain grief. It may be grief for capacities that waited patiently while you completed more urgent tasks. It may be grief for the years in which your attention belonged almost entirely to survival, status, duty, or the management of other people's expectations. This grief cannot be solved by gratitude, because gratitude and mourning perform different psychological functions. You can appreciate the life you have and still mourn the self it did not permit. What you have been calling a loss of direction may be the return of directions you excluded before you were strong enough to face their consequences. Another truth is that confusion is often the psyche's refusal to offer a new identity before you have released the old one. You want clarity because clarity would make change defensible. You want a plan that explains the discomfort, identifies the destination, predicts the costs, and guarantees that the future will justify the disruption. But individuation rarely grants certainty in advance. Jung described transformation through images of death and rebirth because the interval between identities cannot be managed like an ordinary project. Something must lose its authority before the next organizing center becomes visible. A man opens a blank document labeled "Next Chapter." He types 3 possible careers, deletes them, then searches for apartments in a city he has never visited. 10 minutes later, he closes every tab and returns to the spreadsheet from his current job. The cursor blinks in one cell while his hand remains motionless on the mouse. You may believe that indecision proves you should remain exactly where you are. Sometimes it does mean that action is premature. But psychological uncertainty is not the same as absence of movement. Beneath visible stillness, values are rearranging. Old rewards are losing their force. Former ambitions are being judged by standards you did not possess when you chose them. The conscious mind experiences this reorganization as emptiness because it recognizes only answers it can already name. Jung's work with symbols honored this interval. A symbol is alive precisely because it joins what consciousness cannot yet reconcile. It does not give you a slogan, it holds opposites until a third possibility emerges. You may need both stability and freedom, loyalty and truth, solitude and relationship, continuity and change. If you rush to choose one side merely to end the tension, you may reproduce the same divided life in a new setting. This is why sudden reinvention can become another persona. You change clothes, location, vocabulary, profession, or social circle, then demand that the new identity rescue you from ambiguity. The surface changes, but the mechanism remains. You are still asking a role to tell you who you are. The psyche eventually resists that role too. Confusion asks for a different kind of courage. It asks you to remain near what you know is no longer true, without manufacturing certainty about what comes next. It asks you to tolerate being less explainable. It asks you to stop treating every unformed desire as a problem that must immediately become a plan. This is not passive surrender. It is disciplined non-deception. What you have been calling failure to decide may be the psyche protecting the next life from being designed by the same fear that designed the previous one. The conflict becomes sharper when your competence has become your prison. Jung recognized that every strength creates a corresponding shadow. The more identified you become with a valued capacity, the more threatening its opposite appears. If you are known for control, receptivity feels dangerous. If you are known for independence, need feels humiliating. If you are known for endurance, stopping feels like collapse. The strength itself is not the problem. The problem is the belief that you must remain inside it at all times to deserve safety and respect. A woman leads a meeting with calm precision while a headache pulses behind one eye. She answers every question, assigns every task, and waits until the screen goes dark before lowering her face into her hands. When a colleague sends, "You always have it together," she begins typing the truth, then replaces it with a thumbs up. Your environment rewards the capacity that is consuming you. That makes recognition difficult. People praise your availability while your inner life goes unattended. They admire your composure while you lose access to grief. They depend on your judgment while you become unable to hear uncertainty. The very evidence used to prove that your life is working may be evidence that one part of you is working far beyond its human limit. The shadow does not only contain socially unacceptable impulses, it also contains weakness, play, dependence, spontaneity, sensuality, imagination, slowness, and ordinary need when the persona has rejected them. Integrating the shadow means recovering these qualities without allowing them to seize control in distorted form. Unclaimed weakness becomes collapse. Unclaimed anger becomes cruelty or passive resistance. Unclaimed play becomes compulsion. What is consciously welcomed can find proportion. What is exiled tends to return without manners. You may fear that relaxing the dominant strength will destroy everything built upon it. If you stop anticipating every problem, perhaps things will fall apart. If you state what you need, perhaps people will leave. If you admit uncertainty, perhaps respect will disappear. Some consequences may indeed occur. Yet a life that survives only through the permanent overuse of one psychological function is already charging you a hidden price. Jung's model of psychological types showed that consciousness naturally favors certain functions while neglecting others. Development later requires a relationship with the inferior function, the capacity that feels awkward, unpredictable, or shamefully weak. This does not mean becoming the opposite of who you are. It means ending the dictatorship of the part that once kept you safe. What you are calling weakness may be the neglected function through which the next stage of your life is trying to enter. The life that no longer fits will often provoke anger before it permits grief. Anger gives you distance from what has held you. It sharpens boundaries that were blurred by obligation. It reveals where consent became automatic and where compromise became identity. Jung understood emotion as a force that seizes and reorganizes consciousness. Anger can therefore feel like evidence that you have become a worse person, especially if your persona depends on patience, reason, or care. A man hears his partner ask a harmless question about weekend plans. He answers too sharply, then apologizes before the silence has settled. Later, alone in the bathroom, he grips the edge of the sink and realizes the question was not the cause. It touched the place where every hour already feels assigned. If you judge the anger only by its immediate target, you may miss its psychological message. The person in front of you may not deserve the full force of it. But the force may reveal years of unspoken compliance, deferred decisions, and needs translated into helpfulness. Responsibility requires that you do not use inner conflict as permission to wound others. Honesty requires that you do not use good behavior as permission to keep wounding yourself. Beneath anger, grief waits. You grieve the time spent becoming acceptable. You grieve choices made before you understood their hidden motives. You grieve relationships that may not survive your full presence. You grieve the fact that nobody can return your unlived years. Anger says that the old arrangement must stop. Grief admits that even necessary endings contain love. This is why transition can produce nostalgia for a life you do not want back. The psyche is not confused. It is capable of holding value and limitation together. You can miss the certainty of an old role while refusing to re-enter it. Then you can cherish people and still change the terms of access. You can feel tenderness for your former self without allowing that self to choose your future. Marie-Louise von Franz explored how psychological development demands attention to the small, concrete truth rather than inflation through grand ideas. Your anger does not automatically make you liberated. Your grief does not automatically make your choice wise. Each feeling must be listened to, tested, and related to consciously. Otherwise, the fantasy of becoming your true self can become a noble disguise for avoidance, impulsivity, or revenge. What you have been calling bitterness may be grief that has not yet been given permission to tell the whole story. The final truth before any genuine change is that the new self is not waiting fully formed behind a door. You participate in creating it through what you are willing to confront. It is comforting to imagine an authentic self buried beneath social conditioning, complete and certain, needing only to be uncovered. Jung's understanding was more demanding. The self, in his psychology, is not simply your preferred personality. It is the organizing totality of conscious and unconscious life. A relationship with it asks you to include contradictions, limitations, responsibilities, and shadow, not merely follow whatever feels expansive. A woman packs a suitcase after another argument and places it beside the front door. She sits on the stairs, listening to the refrigerator hum in the next room. After several minutes, she carries the suitcase back upstairs, not because the relationship is healed, but because she recognizes that leaving tonight would be an attempt to escape the conversation she must first have. In the morning, she says the sentence she has rehearsed for 3 years. Authenticity is not impulse. It is congruence developed through contact with reality. A desire becomes psychologically trustworthy when you can examine both its promise and its shadow. Does the fantasy of leaving contain genuine movement, or only relief from responsibility? Does staying express devotion, or fear disguised as virtue? Does solitude create contact with your inner life, or protect you from intimacy? Does ambition serve creation, or restore a threatened sense of worth? The honest answer may include both sides. Jung called the encounter with opposites essential because the ego prefers clean stories. It wants one side innocent and the other guilty. It wants the past to be a mistake and the future to be salvation. But wholeness refuses that simplicity. The old life may have been necessary and now be insufficient. The people within it may love you and still be unable to accompany your development. You may need change and still carry patterns that will follow you unless they are faced. The next life emerges through this tension. It forms when you tell one truth without dramatizing it, set one boundary without turning the other person into an enemy, remain with one grief without converting it into a decision, and admit one desire without demanding that it become destiny. These are not steps in a method. They are moments in which the center of authority quietly moves from the persona toward a more complete relationship with the self. You do not become new by declaring yourself new. You become new as your choices stop requiring the abandonment of what you know inwardly. The change may remain invisible for a long time. Your address may be the same. Your work may look similar. The people around you may notice only that certain old permissions are no longer available. Yet inwardly, the contract has changed. What you are calling a search for yourself is not a search for a hidden character who will make every choice easy. It is the practice of no longer making your deepest truth pay for the comfort of a coherent image. Now comes the part you may most want to avoid. The life you built may no longer match who you have become, but recognizing the mismatch does not make you innocent of having maintained it. You trained people to relate to the persona you now resent them for expecting. You said yes when you meant no. You concealed preferences, softened convictions, volunteered strength, and accepted rewards for being predictable. Perhaps you had good reasons. Perhaps speaking earlier was unsafe, impossible, or beyond the awareness you possessed. Compassion for those conditions matters. But compassion cannot erase present responsibility. If you continue blaming only the career, partner, family, city, or social circle, you preserve the fantasy that a new environment will solve a pattern you carry. The external structure may genuinely need to change. Some situations are restrictive, exploitative, or simply finished. Yet the part of you that traded truth for safety must become conscious, or it will negotiate the same bargain under different names. This is the shadow beneath the shadow. You are not only afraid of losing the old life, You are afraid of losing the moral identity that allowed you to remain inside it. If you change, you may no longer be the endlessly loyal one. You may disappoint someone who did nothing obviously wrong. You may become difficult to explain. You may lose admiration that depended on your self-denial. You may have to admit that part of your goodness was a strategy for controlling how others responded to you. Jung insisted that confronting the shadow injures the ego's preferred self-image. It is easier to discover hidden power than hidden manipulation. It is easier to claim suppressed desire than to acknowledge the ways you made others responsible for guessing it. You may have hoped that enough sacrifice would eventually force the world to release you without conflict. You may have waited for a dramatic offense so you could leave with clean hands. Life may offer no such permission. A man sits across from his aging father at a kitchen table. The father describes plans that assume his son will remain nearby for years. The son folds a paper napkin into smaller and smaller squares while saying, "We'll see." He already knows he intends to move. What he fears is not the decision itself, but the moment his father's face reveals the cost. There may be no path that preserves every attachment, reputation, and certainty. This is the price individuation refuses to hide. Becoming more whole can disturb systems organized around your partial presence. A boundary can feel cruel to someone who benefited from its absence. A truthful decision can produce grief in people you love. Their pain does not automatically prove you are wrong, and your need for change does not automatically make every method of change right. You must learn to bear consequence without converting it into self-condemnation or self-exoneration. Self-condemnation would send you back into the old role merely to stop feeling guilty. Self-exoneration would let you treat other people as obstacles in the story of your awakening. Neither response is mature. The more difficult position is to say, "This change may hurt you, I will not pretend otherwise, and I cannot continue purchasing your comfort with my disappearance." The cost may also be internal. Without the old identity, you may lose the familiar explanation for your worth. If you are no longer the achiever, what gives the day structure? If you are no longer needed, what proves you matter? If you stop fighting, who are you without the enemy? The emptiness following a relinquished persona can feel worse than the persona itself, because at least the old suffering told you who you were. This is why many people return to lives they have already psychologically outgrown. They mistake the terror of open space for evidence that the old enclosure was home. They prefer recognizable pain to unstructured possibility. They begin rebuilding the very walls they once begged to escape, then call the return wisdom. You cannot know in advance which parts of your life will survive your honesty. Some relationships may deepen because performance no longer stands between you. Some work may become meaningful after the motive changes. Some obligations may remain, but you may carry them without using them as proof of identity. Other structures may end. The uncertainty is real, and no spiritual language should sanitize it. Jung's path does not promise that wholeness will make you universally understood. It suggests almost the opposite. The closer you come to an inner center, the less completely your choices can be justified by collective standards. This does not place you above other people. It places more responsibility upon you. You must test your motives carefully, because you can no longer hide behind either convention or rebellion. The choice before you is therefore not simply whether to stay or leave. It is whether you will continue organizing your life around the avoidance of disapproval. You may stay in the same place and make the deeper choice. You may leave and still avoid it. The true threshold appears wherever you stop asking permission to know what you already know. You are allowed to stop proving that your old decisions were correct by repeating them forever. You are allowed to let a once necessary identity become history without turning it into an enemy. You do not need to ridicule your former ambitions, deny the love within old relationships, or declare that every sacrifice was wasted. The life you built carried you here. Its value is not canceled because it cannot carry you farther in the same form. You are allowed to stop forcing gratitude to perform the work of truth. Gratitude can honor what has been given. It cannot make a completed chapter become unfinished again. You can be grateful for a home and need to leave it. You can respect a profession and no longer belong within its demands. You can love someone and recognize that the version of you sustained by the relationship is becoming psychologically untenable. You are allowed to stop demanding a complete map before acknowledging the next honest fact. Perhaps you do not know what career comes next, but you know what kind of work is hollowing you out. Perhaps you do not know whether a relationship must end, but you know which conversation can no longer be postponed. Perhaps you do not know who you are becoming, but you know which performance has become unbearable. The next truth does not need to contain the entire future. This permission is not permission for carelessness. It is permission to replace false certainty with conscious attention. You can move slowly, without pretending you are not moving. You can seek therapy, wise counsel, or practical support without surrendering authority over your inner experience. Psychological depth is not threatened by help. Sometimes another person's steady presence is what allows you to distinguish a genuine call from panic, projection, or exhaustion. You are also allowed to remain where you are, while the inner relationship changes. Not every awakening requires a public rupture. Some lives become livable when the hidden bargain ends. Work changes when it is no longer asked to provide identity. Love changes when compliance is replaced by contact. Solitude changes when it is chosen rather than stolen in moments of collapse. Jung's individuation asks neither blind loyalty to the past nor worship of novelty. It asks for a living relationship with the total psyche. That relationship is quieter than dramatic reinvention. It appears in the moment you notice resentment before offering another yes. It appears when you allow grief to exist without treating it as weakness. It appears when you can admire an unlived possibility without immediately using it to condemn your present life. You may still feel guilty. You may still wake with uncertainty pressing against your chest. You may still envy people whose lives appear simple and coherent. Integration does not remove these feelings. It changes your relationship to them. Guilt becomes information rather than a verdict. Uncertainty becomes space rather than failure. Envy becomes a clue rather than a character flaw. The person you have become does not need to destroy the person you were. The deeper task is to bring the old strengths forward without allowing the old fear to remain in command. Your discipline can survive without self-punishment. Your loyalty can survive without self-erasure. Your competence can survive without constant control. Your care for others can survive the discovery that you also exist. You began by accusing yourself of ingratitude because the structure remained standing while your belonging inside it disappeared. From the other side of understanding, the accusation changes. The problem is not that you have failed to appreciate your life. The problem is that you have confused appreciation with obligation to remain psychologically unchanged. The life you built no longer matching the person you have become is not proof that the building was meaningless. It is proof that you were alive inside it, developing beyond the blueprint. A life can be good and still become too small for the truth it helped create. You do not betray your past by refusing to live there forever. You honor it by carrying forward what was real, releasing what was protective, and allowing the person it formed to become more than it could imagine. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you can explore Jung's psychology for those walking the individuation path. Watch the video on your screen now for a deeper look at what happens when your old identity begins to fall away.